We have excellent discussions coming up. On the political side, political diplomatic overview by Dr. Manoj Joshi.
One thing was very obvious. This was a period of incredible change across the world. Some were visible, some were not so visible at the time. The Cold War had peaked in the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The first signs of the Sino-Soviet rift were appearing. In South Asia, India was licking its wounds after the humiliating defeat of the Sino-Indian War of 1962. And America's most allied ally, Pakistan, was establishing close ties with China and working out a détente with the Soviet Union. This is the kind of changes that were occurring. Now, even as Pakistan sought to change geopolitical equations, India was seeking to maintain an even keel in its relationship between the USSR and the United States. And just as the Soviets were trying to do so in their relations with India and China. So you can see that there was lots of balancing going on, lots of change also taking place, things that became visible only later. On the other hand, the United States was struggling to manage its alliance ties with Pakistan and its newer proximity to India after the 1962 war. 1962 had taught us a bitter lesson, that there were no natural allies. There were no allies in NAM, nor were there allies in the Afro-Asian world. Each country had to look out for itself. There was a change of guard in many countries. President Kennedy had been assassinated in November 1963, replaced by Lyndon Johnson, who won a landslide in 1964 November elections. In May 1964, Prime Minister Nehru passed away. Later, in October 1964, the Soviet General Secretary Nikita Khrushchev was ousted from power. Now, the most important development for Indians, obviously, was the passing of Prime Minister Nehru. He was the leader of our freedom struggle, the Prime Minister for the first 17 years of our nation's life, and the man who shaped the India that we know. By the time of his passing, the idealism of the independence movement was fading. India's conditions were not particularly good. The economy was stagnant, and it had staved off famine of food grain from the United States between 1960 and 1964. And the 1965 monsoon had failed. The problem was not that plans were not being implemented. It was that our basic strategy, and this is with the benefit of hindsight, we can say, our basic strategy was wrong. This whole idea of socialistic pattern of society turned out to be wrong. Taken together with the 1962 defeat, there was a mood of pessimism in the country. 1962 had weakened Nehru's position in India as well as in the world. Equally, it had weakened him within his party. The decision-making has shifted from the Prime Minister's house to the Congress Parliamentary Party and to the states. This was the time, if you recollect, there were very powerful leaders in the Congress, S.K. Patil, Sanjeeva Reddy, Nijalingappa, Atulya Ghosh. After his stroke on 7 January 1964 in Bhubaneswar, in the Congress session, Prime Minister Nehru had a stroke. Nehru got Lal Bahadur Shastri back into the cabinet as minister without portfolio. Panditji's death on May 27, 1964 was not unexpected, but at the time it was very sudden. 4 days later, on 31st of May, Lal Bahadur Shastri was elected the Prime Minister in succession of Prime Minister Nehru. Shastri was chosen. The powerful people who were in the CWC thought that, this humble and quiet fellow, we will be able to manipulate him. But subsequent events showed that Shastri was a man of firm views, and also he was an extremely decisive person. Amongst the first, and this was evident in the first task that he had to do, and this was to deal with the Hazratbal crisis. You're all familiar with the Hazratbal crisis, the theft of the holy relic. This happened in 27 December 1963. Though it had reappeared, the hair had reappeared, an action committee had come up of what today we will call separatists. The separatists of today, we transpose them to 64. These were the people who were agitating for the Hazratbal. They wanted the release of Sheikh Abdullah. They wanted a special didar to prove that the relic was a genuine one. The Home Secretary in New Delhi was opposed to the special didar. But as soon as, within a week of becoming minister without portfolio in the government, Shastri went up to Srinagar and he ordered the special didar. And he overruled the Home Secretary, and that kind of calmed down the temperatures. Now, it was at this time that another development happened, that Nehru decided to release Sheikh Abdullah from jail, where he had been in since 1953, barring a brief time in 1958. After holding talks with Nehru, the Sheikh went to Pakistan to discuss a possible resolution to the Kashmir issue. Now, the Indian proposal had been discussed with Nehru and with senior officials in New Delhi. And this probably involved some kind of a condominium between India, Pakistan, and Jammu and Kashmir. But what happened was that the Sheikh left, and while the Sheikh was had his talks with Ayub, Prime Minister Nehru passed away, and Sheikh rushed back to Delhi. Now, Nehru's initiative on Kashmir was not welcomed either by the left or the right or the opposition or even within his own party. They all opposed all this, any change in Kashmir. But Nehru's stature was such that had he made the proposal, maybe he would have pulled it off. But those are one part of the ifs of history. In October, 4 months after taking charge, Shastri had a luncheon meeting with Ayub Khan. He was coming back from Cairo after the non-aligned meeting summit there. This is October 64. And Ayub met him, and later on, it transpired. Ayub said, well, he was not particularly impressed by this short fellow, this dhoti-clad short fellow, and that was that. The Kashmir initiative, of course, died with, what I had referred to, died with Pandit Nehru. The Union government now, after the Hazratbal crisis, tightened its hold in Kashmir. The steps were taken to integrate it closer. Article 356 and 357, which relate to the proclamation of emergency, were now extended to Kashmir. The nomenclature of the Kashmir head of government, which was Prime Minister earlier, was changed to Chief Minister. This all happened in 64-65. And equally important, in June 1965, the Jammu and Kashmir National Conference, the Sheikh's old party, it merged with the Congress party. Now, if you were looking at these developments from Pakistan, it would appear that the window of opportunity in Jammu and Kashmir was shrinking. In 1964, the UN had more or less decided to shelve the discussion. In 1963, there had been 6 rounds of bilateral talks between India and Pakistan, and nothing had come out of it. The Indian rearmament was proceeding apace and would soon blunt the edge of the Pakistan army. So these were the calculations that were going on in Karachi. Now, there's an interesting sidelight. In March 65, Sheikh went on a pilgrimage. Now, he was still out of prison. He had been released in 64. So this is after Nehru's death. In March 65, he went on a pilgrimage to Mecca via UK and returned via Algiers. There he had a strange meeting with Zhou Enlai. No one knows what transpired, but the government of India was not very happy, so they put him back into jail. It's a very interesting thing that a senior CIA contact of the Sheikh, in the 1990s, a book was written by a senior CIA official, and he obviously was a contact of the Sheikh because he was pulled out from Latin America and asked to meet Sheikh in Paris and in Algiers. He writes that the Sheikh was aware of the Operation Gibraltar development. And as the record has shown, that Pakistan had already begun preparing, the defreezing issue had begun. Then, of course, on October 6, 1964, China tested its nuclear device. In the aftermath of the test, Shastri had to confront a lot of pressure. The pressure was from the scientific establishment, from his own party, the AICC, the cabinet, the CPP, AICC, and even in the Lok Sabha, there was pressure that India should cross the nuclear threshold. Shastri's problem was really economic and political. On one hand, the price situation was out of control, and the country was undertaking food rationing. I think many of you will not remember the food ration shops had come up, and you needed food rationing. On the other hand, the defense budget, now estimated at 28% of the central government expenditure, was becoming a real burden. And so now to even go in for a nuclear program would have completely derailed any development efforts that one can think of. In November 27th, 1964, Jansang moved a motion in the Lok Sabha calling for the country to manufacture nuclear weapons. The motion was defeated in a voice vote. But in the speech that Shastri gave when the motion was there, he said, we want nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, but peaceful purposes could include, use for tunneling and for leveling mountains, etc. This was the so-called peaceful nuclear explosion route, which the country eventually undertook. Now, if you were looking at these debates and the pressure, if you're looking at Bhabha saying we can make 50 nuclear weapons for 10 million rupees, all kinds of statements were there in India. If you were looking at it from Pakistan's point of view, you would have been absolutely shaken, because Pakistan didn't even have any kind of capacity in the nuclear area. Now, there's some evidence to suggest that during their visit to Beijing, Bhutto and Ayub had discussed this in March 65. They discussed this with Zhou Enlai. Simultaneously, Bhutto took steps to begin the Pakistani nuclear program. Now, I'd like to just go into this question of the diplomatic overview. Now, there is no getting away from the fact that '62 war had diminished India's standing in Asia and Africa. Nehru had sought to cultivate both China and Soviet Union in the 1950s, but by 1960, the Chinese infatuation was over. But he had instinctively sensed the Sino-Soviet split. Nehru was one of the early persons who realized this and sought to cultivate the USSR. On the other hand, India had become a recipient of massive amounts of American economic and food aid. Now, the Cold War was in a period of transition, and as I said, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, more complex multipolar competition started emerging. This was manifested by the Sino-Soviet split, the increasing tempo of the Vietnam War. It was manifested too by the changing allegiances of Pakistan, as I said, America's most allied ally, which was moving towards, this was a member of SEATO and CENTO, and was moving towards China. By '65, the US military assistance had sharply upgraded Pakistani military capabilities. In today's prices, Pakistan had got some 3 billion worth of arms at that time. India, of course, this program had been finalized by June 1964, the aid program. But India got just some $80 million worth of assistance by the time it was terminated when the war broke out a year later. In 1965, both India and Pakistan were seeking to improve their relations with the US and the Soviet Union. But Pakistan also had the Chinese card up its sleeve. Beginning with the Sino-Pak border agreement in '63, Pakistan had become an important element in Beijing's calculations. In February '64, Zhou Enlai paid a state visit to Pakistan, and a year later, China came up with a $60 million soft loan. Now, this is despite the fact that China was in extremely dire conditions. 40 million people had died in the Great Famine. But China ensured that it was using the money it had for its diplomatic purposes. In March 1965, Ayub received a hero's welcome in his maiden visit to Beijing, which was followed by a visit by him to Moscow in April 3, 1965. So you can see that you have Pakistan playing this game, keeping with China, reaching out to Moscow. But of course, naturally, the Americans were not particularly amused. And on April 15th, when 5 days before he was supposed to go to the US said, cancel the visit. We are not, we don't want all this China and Soviet Union stuff. You're supposed to be our ally. There's one other interesting factor, which I should tell you as of September 1st, 1965. By 1965, China had consolidated itself in Tibet. And on September 1st, that is today, this is the 50th anniversary, the Tibet Autonomous Region was created by hiving out the areas of outer Qinghai Plateau, Amdo, the Kham region of Tibet were taken out and joined with Chinese provinces, and TAR was now constituted as an ordinary province of China. In June '65, and now we are quite close to the war, Foreign Minister Chen Yi and Premier Zhao paid separate visits to Pakistan. In a July 1965 memo to the CIA, the Intelligence and Research Unit of the State Department offered an analysis suggesting that, in quotes, there is some degree of military and or security cooperation between China and Pakistan, and perhaps some kind of understanding in case the other was involved in conflict with India. That means the Americans were pretty well clued in as to what was happening. Now, Shastri followed Ayub to Moscow in May, but to balance with Pakistan, the Americans also canceled his visit. For some time, the Soviet leader, now the thing is that when Shastri went to Moscow, it was not as though he was going to that old friend, because the message coming out of Moscow in these 2 years, 63, 64, 65, was that India must do something on Kashmir. And so when President Radhakrishnan visited Moscow in '64, the joint statement omitted any reference to Kashmir During Shastri's visit, Kosygin told him that the USSR wanted a peaceful settlement of the Kutch dispute, and the joint communique didn't even mention Kashmir or Kutch. When Pak army mounted a covert invasion in August 1965, the Soviets were silent. Now the new US president moved away from the policy of building ties with South Asia towards Southeast Asia. In August of 1964, if you recall, the Gulf of Tonkin incident had taken place. And the war in Vietnam had escalated. In the spring of 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder had begun. That is the bombardment of North Vietnam. And then, to protect the US aircraft which were taking off from bases in South Vietnam, US Marines landed up, and US land commitment in Vietnam began. The US disinterest in the South Asian region was manifested by the fact that when the Kutch problem occurred, the US didn't involve itself. They told the United Kingdom to take the lead in trying to mediate a settlement. The American shift hit India hard because since 1960, as I told you, we were absolutely dependent on economic and food aid from the US. Food prices were spiraling. And just after the 1965 monsoon failed, Johnson decided to use food as a pressure point. So instead of biannual, meaning having 2-year contracts for food aid, Johnson decided to take decisions after every 2 months. And he was personally monitoring this. For some reason, he took it into his head that I want India to change its agriculture policies, and I will decide when the aid goes. So this was the famous episode called the short tether policy, and this is the time when we say that the grain was coming from US from ship to mouth, every month. Now, another angle that Pakistan began to calculate, and which will become important when the war breaks out eventually, was the Islamic one. Based on cento ties, Iran and Turkey and Pakistan began to develop broader ties. To this end, a summit in Istanbul in July '64 led to the creation of the Regional Cooperation for Development Grouping, RCD. A similar angle was developed between Indonesia and Pakistan. This was the period of massive Chinese influence in Indonesia, and it led to the abortive convening of an Afro-Asian summit. That summit never really took place, but the byproduct of this was the Indonesia-Pakistan Economic Cultural Cooperation Pact of August '65. All these were to bear fruit when the war was to break out. China's role is well known. Iran and Turkey provided munition and spares to Pakistan, but not many remember that President Sukarno of Indonesia dispatched 2 submarines and 4 missile boats, but they reached Karachi only after the war. Iran and Turkey provided plane loads of spares, arms, ammunition, despite restrictions from the US. Now, in conclusion, I just want to make a reference to the United Nations Security Council. They had suspended this discussion on Kashmir, and they only took it up after the war eventually broke out. So therefore, I have not really focused on the UN in any great detail. Also, the point I'd like to make is that India's experience with the United Nations had not been particularly good in 1948. So when the Kutch incursion occurred, we didn't go to the UN or anything. And likewise, when the Operation Gibraltar began, again, we stayed away absolutely from the United Nations. So I'll conclude here. Thank you.